What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the FantasyPros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we are talking about 10 players that you should look to stash ahead of the Week 9 slate and ahead of next week's waivers as well. Before we dive on into that list of players, though, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Again, all you have to do, visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app to optimize your roster today. Kicking off our list this week is Carolina Panthers wide receiver Xavier Legette, who's rostered in 23% of leagues. Despite a tough matchup against the Broncos in Week 8, Leggett drew more than 4 targets in a game for the first time since Week 4. He caught 4 of his 7 targets for 34 yards and a score, leading him to a weekly finish of the wide receiver 33. I shouldn't need to do too much explaining here on why Leggett is a great stash ahead of Week 9. First and foremost, he gets the New Orleans Saints defense that's given up the 4th most fantasy points per game to wideouts over the last 4 weeks and the 3rd most receiving yards. The other elephant in the room is that, well, Deontay Johnson is now a Baltimore Raven, and he's leaving behind a 26.5% target share, which was 13th of all wide receivers this year. How those targets will be distributed is still TBD, but Leggett is worth the stash with his upside after moving up the pecking order. Coming in next is Demario Douglas, wide receiver for the New England Patriots, who is also rostered in 23% of leagues. Don't be fooled by his last 2 games. Pop Douglas is still worth a spot on your fantasy team. In Week 7, he had to exit the game early with an illness, and in Week 8, Drake May was knocked out of the game with a concussion. Prior to those 2 games, Douglas had drawn 9 targets in 3 of 4 games between weeks 3 and 6. I can't promise Week 9 is going to look pretty without Drake May most likely, but once he's back and fully healthy, Pop Douglas could PPR volume his way to a solid finish rest of season. If someone gave up too quickly and dropped him in your league, go ahead and stash him now before Drake May comes back. Another Panther to consider stashing this week is wide receiver Adam Thielen, who's rostered in 20% of leagues. I know it's more fun to take the shot on high upside rookies, but let's not forget that just last season, Adam Thielen was drawing nearly 10 targets per game through the first 11 weeks and finished the season 13th in targets at the position with 137. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we can expect 2023 to be replicated, but Thielen has the most experience and has carried the load of being a wide receiver 1 before, even prior to his days in Carolina. As of this recording, Thielen has only practiced in limited fashion, though he logged a few practices before Week 8 too. Again, it's unclear how the targets will be distributed in Carolina, but Thielen and Leggett appear to be the 2 frontrunners in this offense. Fourth on our list is running back Isaac Guerendo of the San Francisco 49ers, who's rostered in 17% of leagues. I completely recognize the 49ers are on bye this week, but there is so much ambiguity in this running back room right now. Jordan Mason exited early in Week 8 with a shoulder injury, which led to Guerendo finishing with 102 yards and a score on 17 touches for 19.2 fantasy points, good for the running back 10 on the week. So will Jordan Mason be ready for Week 10? Maybe, but then there's also Christian McCaffrey in the picture, who's reportedly making his return in Week 10. That would certainly knock Guerendo out of the picture almost entirely. However, we've been gaslit by CMC and the 49ers already this year, so how true is it that he'll return after their bye week? There's enough questions here where I'm willing to stash the certainty of Guerendo, who we know for sure will be ready and available for the 49ers in Week 10. Next up is Michael Wilson, wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals, who's rostered in 15% of leagues. Nothing about this stash is flashy, but Wilson has popped up as a weekly contributor on more than one occasion this year. He's drawn at least 6 targets in half of his games, including Week 8, where he caught 5 of them for 31 yards and a score. The great thing about Wilson is that he has a big frame at 6'2", 213 pounds to be a necessary red zone threat for this team. His matchups against the Bears and Jets before the bye aren't that enticing, but from weeks 12 to 16, he gets the Seahawks twice, the Vikings, the Patriots, and the Panthers, which are all solid matchups for the Cardinals wide receivers. Another wide receiver I'm more excited about stashing this week is Elijah Moore of the Cleveland Browns, who's rostered in 12% of leagues. Just as we expected, the Browns' passing attack was far more functional with Jameis Winston at quarterback. In their upset over the Ravens, Moore led the team in targets with 12, catching 8 of them for 85 yards. It's not going to be every week that we see Moore drawing double-digit targets, but he does find himself on the team that's third in passing play percentage this year behind only Seattle and Dallas. Elijah Moore could certainly see 6 to 8 targets fall his way consistently without Amari Cooper anymore, so stash him at the end of your bench to see if anything can come from his 16.5-point game last Sunday. If you're in a pinch at quarterback, look to stash Joe Flacco of the Indianapolis Colts this week, who's rostered in 12% of leagues. Shane Steichen has made it seem like this isn't a temporary change to Flacco and that Anthony Richardson will be riding the pine until further notice. Flacco has given us 2 different results in his 2 games started for Indy this year. In Week 5, he finished as the quarterback 4, throwing for 359 yards and 3 scores on 44 attempts. But then in Week 6 against Tennessee, he only threw for 189 yards and 2 scores for only 14.6 fantasy points. The good news here is that Flacco should give you multiple touchdowns more weeks than not. The only game he didn't throw multiple touchdowns in since last season was in the playoffs against Houston. Your league mates will be all over Flacco after he dices up the Vikings secondary in Week 9, so beat them to the punch now before he becomes a popular waiver wire ad next week. Our next stash is Chicago Bears running back Khalil Herbert, who's rostered in 7% of leagues. Khalil Herbert has given you big fat zeros over the last 4 games, but I have zero interest in stashing him for his role on the Chicago Bears. The NFL trade deadline is next Tuesday, November 5th, and there's a decent chance Khalil Herbert will be on the move. He was almost moved 2 weeks ago when Darren Wolfson reported that the Minnesota Vikings had called about Herbert's availability before settling on Cam Akers. Will the team meet the price demands of the Chicago Bears? Maybe, but if he does go to a team like Dallas, he becomes an intriguing option rest of season. Worst comes to worst though, you drop him for another upside stash next week if he doesn't get dealt at the deadline. Our final wide receiver stash this week is Parker Washington of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who's rostered in 4% of leagues. There's not much to work off here for Parker Washington other than it may just come down to the process of elimination. Christian Kirk is done for the year with a collarbone injury, and as of this recording, Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. have only practiced in limited fashion while dealing with their respective injuries. Evan Ingram is the only other prominent pass catcher that's fully healthy right now, so if both Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas miss Sunday's game against the Eagles, Parker Washington will be in line to see a big uptick in volume. Last but not least, for all of you playing in leagues where you start a defense and special teams, you can look to stash the New York Giants, who are rostered in only 4% of leagues. Your crazy stat of the day is that the Giants defense is currently a top 12 scoring unit in fantasy football this year, and they currently lead the league in sacks with 35. As we know, we're not targeting their Week 9 matchup against the Commanders with this stash, but we are targeting their Week 10 matchup against the Panthers. This unit is available in 96% of leagues, so now is the time to pounce on the Giants defense to assure you have them for a great matchup in Week 10. Alrighty, y'all, that is it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Again, all you have to do, visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app to optimize your roster today.